All right, so the kingdom is an absolute disaster at this point. What a mess. This is what happens when people think that they can do God's job better than God can. Once upon a time, in Genesis 12, God spoke to a man called Abraham and made a covenant, a promise with him, and he said, I will be your God. You will be my people. I'm going to give you land, countless descendants. And Abraham, I'm going to bless you and your family so that my blessing can reach out into all the nations of the world. God then established that same covenant with Abraham's son, Isaac, and then his son, Jacob. Generations later, God heard the cries of the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who had been living in slavery in Egypt. God called them out, saved them, and through Moses led them through the sea on dry land. God gave these people, God's people, 10 words, we call them commandments, for living in relationship with God and one another. When they arrived in the land that was promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, God faithfully chose judges from among the 12 tribes to lead the people as arbiters of God's ways. But despite all of this, despite everything God had done for them, the way that God had saved them, the way God's hand had guided them, all the ways that God had been faithful to the people were not satisfied. They saw what other nations had, and they wanted it for themselves. Mortal kings and queens. I often wonder why they wanted this so badly. Was it because they felt maybe less established, less evolved, too tribal in the face of kingdoms and monarchies? I don't know. Maybe they felt a human king would give them clout when it came to trading or even wars. I don't know. But for whatever reason, the people pleaded with God to give them a king. And so, like a parent worn down by the whining child, I know nothing about this, God gave in. It's never a good idea to give in. God chose and anointed the first king from the tribe of Benjamin. It started good for King Saul, but then it quickly turned sour. As his monarchy began to crack, as his heart gradually turned from the Lord, another was chosen. Another was anointed, this time from the tribe of Judah, at a secret ceremony at his dad's house. Young David, the shepherd boy, would be the next king of God's people. And David never lifted his hand against King Saul, and he often fought for him against their enemies. But by the time Saul and his son Jonathan died, David was ready to take up the mantle as king. And that's where we ended last week. It was a politically charged experience, and it continued to be so for the duration of David's reign. At 30, David became the king of Judah. That is, you have to picture a map here, okay? The southern 2 tribes of the people of God. 7.5 years later, the northern 10 tribes, having tried to make a go of it for themselves under the kingship of one of Saul's descendants, finally conceded, and they crawled down to David begrudgingly, asking him to be their king too. During David's reign of these 2 kingdoms, now united, at least 3 civil wars or rebellions are recorded. It was not as idyllic a time as our Sunday school stories led us to believe. The first monarchy ended in a monumental failure. The second struggled to keep its footing. The third monarchy was established under David's son, King Solomon. And like Saul, it started good, but it took a pretty steep descent by the end. This is what happens when people think they can do a thing better than God. It's a bit of a disaster. Upon Solomon's death, somewhere around 930 BC, the kingdom was on the brink of collapse. In 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 9, we read, "The Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord." You see, Solomon, for all his wisdom, allowed idolatrous worship, and he had even built high places of worship for the gods of other nations, the gods of many of his wives. In addition, Solomon had powerful enemies, people who loathed David and his descendants, people who hated Israel. And finally, as if that was not enough, there was division within Solomon's ranks too. Solomon's monarchy, which started so well, ended up doomed like the others. Enter Jeroboam. He was a trusted official to King Solomon. He had been recognized for his industriousness. So Solomon set him in charge of all the forced labor of the house of Joseph. Jeroboam was liked by the people. In fact, his name means he pleads the people's case. Now it came to pass that during the descent of Solomon's reign, Ahijah, the prophet of Shiloh, came to Jeroboam and prophesied to him, saying, "And I, the Lord, will take you, Jeroboam, and you shall reign over all that your soul desires, and you shall be king over Israel." Added to this, the Lord gives Jeroboam a command that kind of sounds like the command he once gave to Solomon. "And if you listen to all that I command you, and walk in my ways, and do what is right in my eyes by keeping my statutes and commandments, as David my servant did, I will be with you," the Lord said, "and will build you a sure house, as I built for David, and I will give Israel to you." Once again, a monarch was chosen who was in no way in line to the throne, yet God saw potential in him and made a covenant with him. But the promise didn't make him, did you notice this? The promise didn't make him king of everything. It made him king of Israel, the 10 northern tribes. In this promise, in this prophecy, the splitting of the kingdom was made inevitable. It was God's will. This is the fallout when people think they can do something better than God can. Saul, then David, then Solomon. 1, 2, 3 strikes, you're out. The kingdom was split. Meanwhile, Solomon's son, not totally clued into what was going on with Jeroboam because he had taken off to Egypt, Solomon's son, Rehoboam, come on, could they come up with different names though? Really? I should have called them like Jim and Chuck for this service. I don't know. Rehoboam tried to continue the family dynasty. So he is King David's grandson. Looking for advice at the outset of his rule, he turned to wise mentors who encouraged him towards servant leadership, something that King David had demonstrated in his monarchy as well. Well, Rehoboam said no thank you to that. So instead, he turned to his frat buddies, as it were. Enter toxic masculinity. And their advice, those who are under 18, close your ears. Say to the people, "You thought Solomon was bad. I've got more girth in my little finger than my dad has in his loins," is the cleaned up version. I'll let you figure out what they were saying. I left that out of Myra's reading. Rehoboam ups the tax burdens on his people. And that's it. We're out, says the North. We're out of here. And while this event is the catalyst to that division, in truth, there had been animosity for generations between the 10 tribes and the 2 tribes, the North and the South. It sounds like Game of Thrones. There were both external enemies and internal pressures that made a successful united monarchy near impossible. The revolt of the northern tribes was prophesied, and it was successful under Jeroboam. That is, until he got neurotic about his people, that they might travel to Jerusalem to worship God and decide to stay down there and reunite with the descendant of King David and the people of Judah. So trying to keep his people out of the south, he decided to create two places of worship in the north, stick a couple golden calves in them, that worked last time, didn't it? And encouraged his people to stay home to worship. It was no longer well with Jeroboam's reign. Through the agency of flawed human beings, God's will, the division of the kingdoms of God's people, was accomplished. Now, you're probably wondering why any of this is important. Let me start from a biblical narrative perspective. Most of the stories from here on out in the Old Testament are told of either Judah to the south or Israel to the north. There are two bodies of God's people now, and sometimes when we're reading the scriptures, we get confused. We don't know who's talking to who, and all their names sort of sound alike. Pay attention. To the north is Israel, the south is Judah. They will be attacked at different times and separately by growing empires. They will be exiled differently. Prophets will come and speak to them separately. And after the exile, the northern tribes are simply considered lost, absorbed into Babylon. But the bitter taste in Jewish people's mouths remain towards those from the north. You know who comes from the north? Samaritans. That should ring a bell. The parable of the Good Samaritan, perhaps? The Samaritan woman at the well, perhaps? Jesus often references Samaritans in his teaching and has no problem interacting with them in his ministry. It's as if old wounds, old divisions are healed in the presence of the Messiah. Understanding the deeply rooted angst between the people who have the same family tree is essential in understanding what happens going forward into the New Testament. This is why people of Jewish background can pick up our New Testament and understand it far better than we can, because they know the family squabbling behind it all. But this passage and understanding this history is also important for us today. I mean, maybe not. What does all this politicizing and squabbling have to do with our culture today? What do we know of geographical areas wanting to split or secede or Brexit or separate from other areas? Whole countries, provinces, areas wanting to separate from their colleagues? I mean, that's enough. Just turn on the news, right? Western Canada is not happy with Monday's results. Quebec is never happy. I was born there, I can say it. Brexit is still a looming issue. I don't know where they are on that. Come on, this stuff still happens today, right? The northern and the southern kingdoms split from one another. That's our story. That's humanity's story, over and over and over again, through monarchies and democracies and oligarchies. It doesn't matter. It's always a mess. The only constant is God's faithfulness. And God has seen it all, and God has managed to work God's grace through it all. That's good news. This Sunday also marks the celebration of the Reformation. Did you know that? That time in church history about 500 years ago, when countless Christians separated from the Catholic Church. The Protestants no longer believed in a human mediator, that would be the Pope. The Protestants no longer believed in having to beg, borrow, barter, or pay extortionate costs to receive grace and forgiveness and mercy. Only Christ is king and head of the church. Only Christ is the mediator between human beings and God the Father. Convictions held so deeply that we were willing to rip ourselves off the branch of our mother church. Hoping, believing, praying, trusting that God would go with us into this new era. The people of God were split once again, and then again, and then again, and again, and again, and now we have thousands of Christian denominations across the planet, all because we were just trying to do our best, and sometimes we think we can do it better than God can. The monarchies didn't work. Self-serving and oppressive royal policies of David and Solomon are what Samuel warned would happen when the people requested a king. They are not in keeping with the expectations that the king would be the one who delivers the needy when they call the poor and those who have no helper, has pity on the weak and the needy, and from oppression and violence, redeeming their life. That's Psalm 72. Rehoboam was so intent on outperforming Solomon that he breaks the kingdom that Solomon led, and Jeroboam was so intent on holding on to the kingdom that he actually led it astray. This is the fallout. Maybe we have something still to learn about this today. Maybe this story is still very important to us today. Maybe we have something to learn about releasing the need to control, to divide, and to do it our way. Maybe we have something still to learn about actually trusting God, and doing the hard work of staying together in the power of God's goodness. Because you know what the vision is at the end of all this, at the end of the book that we love? Do you know what the picture is at the end? It's all the nations and all the people coming to the river of God, the garden, the New Jerusalem, all gathered together as one. No more fighting, no more splitting, no more grappling for power, no more tears, no more injustice, no more war, no more illness, no more dying. One family of God, united in Christ by the power of the Holy Spirit. We can't do that better than God. We must trust God and leave it in his hands. And I wonder if that still gives us something to think about today. To God be all the glory. Amen.